In the midst of the growing economic and political conflict between China and the United States, a new kind of war has emerged. One waged through soybeans. These small grains have become a symbol of a fierce global struggle between two major powers competing for influence and economic dominance. On October, tensions between Beijing and Washington escalated after U.S. President Donald Trump announced his plan to impose an additional 100% tariff on Chinese imports. For Beijing, this was seen as a new act of aggression in the long and bitter trade war between the two nations. China's response came swiftly, declaring that it would not yield to American pressure and was ready to face any economic or political escalation, no matter the cost. These tensions come after a series of punitive measures taken by the U.S. government against Chinese companies and institutions, including placing 15 firms on the Department of Commerce's blacklist and sanctioning Chinese oil refineries that import Iranian crude. Beijing viewed these actions as attempts to blackmail and pressure China into making commercial and strategic concessions. But this time, China's response was completely different. Instead of limiting itself to diplomatic protests, Beijing decided to confront Washington on the economic battlefield, using its most effective leverage: U.S. soybean exports, one of the pillars of the American agricultural sector. For decades, China has been the world's largest importer of soybeans, accounting for about 61% of global trade in this essential commodity. Soybeans are a key ingredient in animal feed production, particularly for pigs, which are the main source of animal protein in China. Any disruption in soybean supplies therefore poses a direct threat to China's food security. However, despite recognizing the importance of this resource, Beijing chose to use it as an economic weapon against Washington. In May 2025, China completely halted its imports of American soybeans, once worth over $12 billion annually. The decision was a devastating shock to American farmers, who heavily rely on the Chinese market to sell their crops. In previous seasons, China had purchased more than half of America's soybean exports, representing over 20% of total U.S. production. This sudden halt threw American farmers into an unprecedented crisis. Their crops piled up, prices collapsed, and calls grew louder for President Trump to take urgent action. But Washington found itself powerless to change Beijing's decision. China had already prepared for such a scenario, securing alternative suppliers from Brazil and Argentina, while building a massive strategic reserve estimated at more than 44 million metric tons. Meanwhile, American farmers found no other market large enough to replace China. No other country in the world had the same level of demand. Fear began spreading among U.S. agricultural communities of a total collapse in a sector built over 40 years around Chinese demand. In fact, U.S. agricultural exports to China dropped by more than 50% in the first half of the year, leading to multi-billion-dollar losses. Trump tried to calm farmers' anger, promising financial compensation funded by the tariffs collected from China. But those promises weren't enough. Farmers knew that subsidies, even if paid, wouldn't fix the core issue. They were only a temporary solution, unable to stop the long-term decline. The American agricultural economy had become deeply dependent on the Chinese market, and if China stayed away for too long, one of the main pillars of rural America would collapse. The crisis was not only economic but also political. The regions most affected by the loss of exports were located in America's central states, the heart of Trump's and the Republican Party's electoral base. With the 2026 midterm elections approaching, Republicans feared that this crisis could cost them vital support from these traditionally loyal rural voters. China, on the other hand, appeared calm and confident. It viewed the trade war not merely in terms of short-term profits or losses, but from a long-term strategic perspective. For Beijing, this confrontation is about sovereignty, about asserting its place on the global stage and rejecting what it sees as American blackmail. The Chinese government believes that enduring temporary economic pain is far less costly than appearing weak before its greatest rival. That's why it prefers to pay the price now to establish its image as a power that cannot be intimidated or broken by sanctions. And indeed, this strategy seems to be working. The more Washington escalated tariffs, the more Beijing responded with measured but firm counteractions, cutting agricultural imports, tightening export controls on rare earth minerals, and signaling that it was prepared for a prolonged standoff. Yet, after months of tension, events took a surprising turn. In an effort to calm angry voters in U.S. agricultural states and on the sidelines of the recent APEC summit in South Korea, Presidents Trump and Xi reached a semi-announced truce. China agreed to resume purchasing massive quantities of soybeans and other American agricultural products. The agreement also included a freeze on reciprocal punitive port tariffs and the suspension of certain Chinese restrictions on rare earth exports, in exchange for a symbolic reduction in selected U.S. tariffs related to other disputes. However, analysts argue that this truce represents little more than a tactical pause, a short-term maneuver driven by domestic and economic pressures on both sides. While Trump presented the deal as a political victory, critics pointed out that China's concessions were largely symbolic, purchasing commodities it already required while gaining time to strengthen its technology sector. Economists believe that both countries are merely repositioning, the U.S. seeking to appease its farmers before elections, and China accelerating its push for technological self-sufficiency and new trade partnerships with Brazil and Argentina. In essence, the so-called Busan Truce does not mark the end of the trade war, but rather a temporary lull in a far larger contest for global economic and technological dominance. As both nations regroup for the next phase, many observers warn that this fragile calm may soon give way to a new and even more intense round of confrontation.